All right, everyone, welcome to Extra Extra, the He-Man and the Masters of the Universe newspaper comic strips panel. Just a few quick announcements before we get started here. My glasses broke, so I have to hold them like a pince-nez here. All right. Okay, at the front row is reserved for Power Pass holders, so if there's a Power Pass holder there, I don't think we're going to have a problem with that. No filming is allowed as we have an official videographer taking care of that and filming the panels. Who's not here at the moment? I think he's here somewhere. I don't know. Okay, and yeah. Awesome. How about we go down the row and everyone introduce themselves? We start with you, Karen. What's your name and the role you played on the newspaper strips?
I'm Karen Wilson, and I am blessed to be married to this amazing man, Chris Weber. We are both writers on the original series for Filmation, and on the newspaper strip, I was the editor.
And my name is Chris Weber, and I was the writer for the newspaper strip for 13 of the 14 story arcs. So I did all of them except the first one, which was done by Jim Schurr. And Karen and I together, we did an episode of He-Man from the first series and 2 episodes of She-Ra.
I'm Gerald Forton. I'm a cartoonist, and I drew the He-Man strip.
Connie Schurr, and I worked at Filmation as an assistant animator and a prop designer and in development, and I was the colorist on the He-Man comic strip for Sunday.
Now, you all worked at Filmation. How did your jobs at Filmation lead into your work on the comic strips? How did that happen?
In fact, I was frustrating by doing only character design and all that.
Yeah.
And Stanley was
yeah.
coming from New York to have a studio here in Los Angeles, and I saw the opportunity to be able to do comics again. But when I said that to Scheimer, the owner of Filmation,
Lou Scheimer, yeah.
that I was going to leave him to go to Marvel, he said, okay, we can do a strip here too. So he said, okay, and he took care of everything to the newspaper and all that, and I started doing that,
Yeah. So Lou Scheimer himself actually got you the job working on the newspaper strip. Oh,
Yeah.
wow. And you also, little known fact, Gerald Forton also drew the original Filmation style guide, which we recently discovered that was you, because there was a question as to who drew that style guide, and it was actually it was Gerald. Yeah.
I was character designer. you
Yeah.
know, So, yeah.
Wonderful.
The first year, I was hired to do all the action scene of He-Man, doing everything, jumping, lifting stuff and all that, to build a kind of library in which the writer could pick up scenes already done, to gain time and money.
So that art was the basis of the stock shots, which you recognize from He-Man, of him throwing rocks, running across the screen.
Yeah.
Any of the, and they tended to be the best animated because they used them over and over again.
Yeah.
Yeah, exactly.
Now, how about you, Chris and Karen? How did your work at Filmation lead into the comic strips?
Well, I went to work for Filmation initially as a production assistant. So I was working in the development department, making corrections on presentations and moving material from the presentations back and forth between the artists and the writers. And Gerald is one of our very good designers in the development department. Connie was part of the development department too. And Jim Schurr started off doing the comic strip, and maybe Gerald could tell you some more about the very beginnings. And then after he had been working on it for about 3 months, in the meantime, Karen and I had written the episode of He-Man called The Toymaker, and that was our first professional animation script, and we did that for Filmation. So Robbie London, who was the head of our department, came over to me and said, well, you know, we're going another direction on the comic strip, so would you want to take a shot at doing the writing for the comic strip? And so for the next 4.5 years, I worked with Gerald doing the He-Man and Masters of the Universe daily comic strip.
I didn't work for Filmation.
Well, you're freelance.
No, I was a freelancer, but I didn't have the opportunity to work there. But I did go and visit there quite a bit. It was kind of a fun place, very a hive of activity, of wonderful ideas. Because my husband worked in development, I could sneak down and you know, they covered the walls and things with all kinds of neat projects that were coming up. So it was nice to look in on it. But no, I only got to work for them as a freelancer.
Okay. And how about you, Connie?
I started at Filmation in layout department, and then that department got laid off, and so then I moved into assistant animating, and most of those people had already been laid off by that time. So I was there as an assistant animator when the He-Man Toy Fair commercial was being animated. So Bob Arkwright came to me one day and said, you know, we only have a couple of you guys left that haven't been laid off yet, so can you work on this for us for a while? So I was privileged to be able to be an assistant animator on the very first Toy Fair animated commercial that was done by Filmation for Mattel. And that was shown at that Toy Fair. And at that time, there was a big controversy about it because mothers all over America were complaining that the TV show that resulted from that was nothing more than a commercial for the action figures that Mattel was creating. So then, anyhow, I went after that. I became an assistant in the model department under Carol Lundberg, I think it was. I'm sorry if I messed up her last name, but so I did props and some incidental character design for He-Man and the Masters of the Universe. And then John Grusd brought me into development as a colorist for the development department and as a graphic designer also. And while I was there, the whole comic strip started, and I just happened to be there coloring for other presentations, and just that was one of the things that I was given to do. And then I just ended up being the colorist for the Sunday comic strips that way.
Now, how much involvement was there from Mattel? Because this was actually started out as a project, a joint project between Filmation and Mattel. They were working because Mattel and Filmation had a very close working relationship at that time. How much involvement was there from Mattel, and how long was Filmation in the picture when this was happening? Because they dropped out pretty early because Filmation was closing its doors during the run of the strip. So, can you address that?
I have no idea.
No.
Well, I know that Mattel and Filmation, as Gerald was saying, they got the idea with Lou of doing the comic strip, because after the 2-year run of He-Man in the United States, you know, Schurr was starting, but they wanted to keep the He-Man name alive. And so they wanted to keep Gerald around too. So they started doing the comic strip. And the way Mattel was involved at the beginning was they would feed us characters that they were about to release, or vehicles or situations, and then they would send art to Gerald, and they would send pictures and stuff to us, and we would figure out ways to incorporate the new toys they were selling into the stories that we were writing. So they weren't really living advertisements. They were just sort of incidentally put into the story that we were doing in any case, except for a couple of them, like King Hiss was the lead character in that story, so that whole story revolved around him.
I don't remember the connection with
I do remember how excited, though, Gerald, everybody was when they found out that you were going to be the artist on the comic strip, and the reason being is that they wanted it to be an international strip, not just syndicated in the United States. And Gerald is really famous, all over the world and other places for his artwork and for his comic work.
Yeah, but in fact, the comic book was my field.
So a lot of people in the United States haven't had an opportunity to be exposed to his work, but over in Europe, he's Stan Lee over in
Yeah.
Europe.
Yeah.
So
Look on French
Well-known
Wikipedia.
and
Look him up.
well-liked. How's that?
so everyone was. I remember how excited Chris was,
Yeah.
and particularly how excited Chris was that he was going to be able to get to work with you.
Yeah, it was exciting.
When afterwards, if you come by the table that we're set up at the dealer's room, Gerald has some of the books from the European comic books and cartoon strips that he had done and has been doing since then. So you might drop by and he can show you some of that.
And he has some of the original He-Man strips at his table
Yeah,
as
not-
well.
Not
Yeah.
much left.
There's one left.
One left. Wow. Now, I think few people realize how, well, at least until the book came out, how long this strip ran. It ran all over the world in newspapers, internationally, as was mentioned here, for, Brazil, United States, India, all over, Canada. And you worked on this strip. This was a 7-day-a-week comic strip that ran for 4.5 years. I think we wound up with 1,174 strips altogether. Now, this must have been quite grueling. What was the? I would like to hear from all of you on this. Like, what was the process like of working on a daily comic strip?
Well, I can tell you when Chris first came home from the job, and I said, "You're going to write a comic strip? We don't know anything about writing comic strips. Are you mad?" And he said, "Well, it's think of it as writing a feature movie. It's just a very, very wide story arc." And so, that's how Chris pitched it to me. And so he did some stories and got them to Mattel, and they approved them. And then we began to break them down as to, going across a calendar and understanding that some people don't read, the Monday through Friday strip. They only see the Saturday or Sunday strip. The stories have to make sense only on Sunday, from one Sunday to another Sunday, and only Monday through Friday or Monday through Saturday. Plus, they had to make sense with 1 or 2 panels missing from the front, because some people wouldn't publish those panels.
That's on the
Yeah.
Sunday strip. Gerald would draw it in essentially a 9-panel format, unless we did some double panel things.
Yeah.
But then the different newspapers, some of them would only publish 6 panels, or some of them would publish 7 panels.
Yeah.
So we had to design the story so that the top 2 panels would be interesting and help the story along, but if you didn't see them, you'd still get what was happening.
Yeah, I remember.
Yeah.
Yeah.
Gerald, how much did you? How long did it take you to draw the strips?
In fact, because I had the full work at Filmation, I was able to do the 7 days, including the Sunday, the weekend.
Oh, over the weekend, he drew all 7 days of the strip in one weekend. Wow.
And the Sunday page.
And the Sunday page. Wow, that's amazing.
Yeah.
Wow. How about you, Connie?
Well, I only did the Sunday strips, so it was pretty simple for me. All I had to do was wait for Gerald to finish his Sunday, and then I'd get a copy of that, and then I would coordinate with King Publishing, Syndicate, when they needed to have my colors in, and then I'd just overnight it to them, FedEx it to them. And usually I'd have it done Wednesday night, Thursday morning, and they'd have it, the day before, a couple days before. But I was like a week up on it, so, we were like a week in advance on everything.
Chris,
And
did
they
you
were
have-
great. They were great to work with. I even went to Connecticut to their offices and did a couple strips in their offices. So that was fun.
Oh, wow.
Yeah.
Huh.
Connie, could you explain to them how you did the coloring?
Well, this was back when there was no computers. So the color was cut in by a stripper who cut it in with amberlith or rubylith. And the syndicate would give you a printout of 64 colors, which is all that they could have. And then each color would have a number on it. And the colors were made up by combining CMYK colors with various dot grain over them to make a pure color, and then there'd be gradations of that color and then mixed with the next color so that you'd get 64 colors in total that you could use. And then I have, if you come by the table, I can show you some of the cells from Filmation that had the colors on them that were from the ink and paint department. So I'd take those colors and match them as closely as I could to one of the 64 colors that was possible through King Syndicate's color chart. And then I would indicate that either with a magic marker or with colored pencils on the copy of Gerald's artwork, and then put a call out, to the syndicate, what number of their color should be put in there. And then if I had to shade anything, I would shade that, with a colored pencil on the side if I wanted a shadow or something, and then put another call out that would be a different color or darker shade of the same color. So it was a little, you couldn't really tell for sure exactly how it was going to turn out because you were working with such a vague concept. They gave me their color chart, was beautiful when I got it, but of course it was printed on much nicer paper than newsprint, and sometimes you'd see it printed in the newspaper and it would be off registration and everything would have a red or yellow halo around it because they hadn't lined it up properly when they printed it. Or sometimes it would be if you got the first part of the run and the press wasn't up yet, you'd get a very diluted color scheme because in the newspaper industry, quality is not an issue. Usually it's just, get it out. So sometimes you'd get the first run of an issue and it'd be pastel kind of. So it was interesting to work like that.
And of course, it would vary from newspaper to newspaper because they were all working with different presses and interpreting the work that Connie sent them, in their own way. And this is people all around the world.
And I was going to ask about that. We found in our search for the comic strips that the later strips were completely devoid of color, at least in the 2 newspapers we found that printed them that late in the run. There were no colors. Like, do you know what happened, Connie? Any
Well,
thoughts?
I only worked on the Sunday strips for about a year and a half or 2 years.
Oh.
So after that, I think that King Syndicate went out of business. And I can't remember if that was in the middle of the strips or not. It was. So
We ended up with, over the run of the strip, we had 2 different syndicators, and for a while Mattel was syndicating it themselves.
So I only worked with King Syndicate. That was the only people that I worked with. So after they went out of business, that may be when they weren't doing a color Sunday anymore.
Yeah, and I'd never seen Sunday comics printed in black and white, but those Sunday comics for He-Man, toward the end, if you have the book, you'll see that they turn into black and white comics, and that's how they were actually published in the newspaper. There were just no colors on them. Now, you wrote 15 different stories, or 14. You wrote 14, and Chris wrote the one storyline. Chris, now there were a lot of different. What's that?
Other way around. Jim wrote one and
Oh, I'm sorry. I was up late last night. I was watching the Power Tour. Okay. So there were quite a number of original characters that you came up with, that you wrote into the scripts, and that Gerald created visuals for, characters like the Fault Master and Miranda, Duke Tiburon. Lots of Yandere, the Ice Empress, really cool villainess if you haven't read the story yet. So cool. Okay. Out of these characters, which which one was kind of your favorite, and would you like to see any of them made as figures in the long-running Masters of the Universe Classics toy line?
I don't have any, I mean, they're all very fantastic by themselves, so I don't have any preference.
That was an advantage that we had over perhaps many other strips because Gerald's an expert character designer. So I would just say, well, I want a lady in her 30s who has long dark hair and is, fabulously good looking, and Gerald, of course, would be an expert at cranking one of those out. So Miranda was a love interest for Man-at-Arms through a number of stories. She was an ambassador from one of the other countries on Eternia and was attendant of the court. And then Duke Tiburon was one of the chief advisors to King Randor, and he was this very snooty kind of guy, and Gerald did a great job with him. And then there were a number of other characters. The guy who was our best man at our wedding, good friend of ours, name was Eric. So I said, gee, I'd like to honor Eric. So you know how you always have He-Man saying to the guard, well, go put the guards over here or go put the guards over there. So when one of the guards would be coming on screen, it would be Eric the guard. So Gerald came up with, one particular guard model that when we needed a name for a guard, it would be Eric the guard. And we ended up using him as a major character in one of the stories.
Yeah.
I'd like to see Miranda as a character,
As a figure?
Wouldn't that be nice?
Lady Miranda?
Lady
That would
Miranda.
be awesome.
Wouldn't that be awesome?
The polls are coming up, though, vote for the figure, so vote for Lady Miranda. Now, Gerald, you also did storyboard work for Toy Story, the movie Toy Story,
Yeah.
and the film adaptation
That
of...
was an exception because I didn't want to work for Disney, but
Oh, really? You didn't want to work for Disney?
they don't pay overtime. And it was a
Can you talk into
studio
the
with-
microphone? So
studio was subcontracting Disney stuff, so I work on Toy Story 2.
okay. What's storyboarding like in comparison to working on a comic strip? Is it a...
Oh yeah, it's exactly the same.
Oh, yeah?
Yeah.
Okay. So making a comic of
You
the
have
movie,
more
basically.
time to, if you want to develop a scene, you have more time in storyboard than in comic books, of course.
Mm-hmm.
But for me, it's the same kind of work.
Chris and Karen, I noticed while I was reading through your strips when we were working on the book that occasionally you run across a reference to Doctor Who or Star Trek. I noticed a Star Trek reference in one of them. So what's that all about?
Well, we were just having some fun because Adam's mother in the original concept was from Earth. So we said, okay, well, she used to tell Adam bedtime stories about, and we wouldn't mention them by name, but we would imply Doctor Who and Star Trek, and we did the whole Alice in Wonderland story, which was one of the books that Queen Marlena had brought with her from Earth, because she had been an Earth astronaut, if you remember that backstory. So we were able to just have a little fun putting some of those, what's the word they use?
Easter eggs?
Easter eggs, yeah, little Easter eggs for the fans of various sci-fi shows out there.
Are you fans yourselves of those
Oh,
shows?
yes.
Yes, Karen and I originally met at a science fiction convention.
Chris, tell them how you proposed to me.
Oh, okay. This is a complete sidebar, if you don't mind. We've been going out for a year after we had met, and I was finishing up my degree, and I said, well, Karen, I don't want to make any commitments till I finish my degree. So I finished my degree. I'm coming down off the stage getting my diploma, and Karen's bouncing up and down on her toes, and my mom is smiling, and
It's
my grandmother's
time.
smiling, and oh boy, it's on me now. So I started asking her, well, if if I was to propose to you, what would you like it to be like? And she said, oh, it should be romantic, tell us.
Soft music, it should be by the ocean, there should be candlelight.
So I didn't know if I would be able to pull together something like that, but we were going to go see the first week that opened of Star Trek II, The Wrath of Khan, and we were going to be in line at the Grauman Theater in Hollywood, which is the big one with all the footprints on the sidewalk and so forth. So we're in line there with a bunch of our friends, and we come up with some kind of story on my friend Eric needed to go to the car because he was going to get some flowers for his girlfriend, and Karen had to go with him, and so we got Karen out of the way. While she was gone, I handed out kazoos to all the friends that were with
The
us.
kazoos were the soft music.
And I handed out little candles, so they all had lit candles. So Karen comes back, and the group of friends kind of opens up like this, and they all have their candles, and they start playing the Star Wars theme on their kazoos. And then, Karen looks around, she goes, well,
Where's the ocean?
I had that covered. One of my friends whips out a giant-sized postcard of Santa Monica Beach. Another friend has a glass of water and starts going like this with the glass of water. And then I got down on my knees and I proposed to Karen. And fortunately, she said yes. After all that, it would have been. But they ended up writing this up in 2 different books about Star Trek fandom. So that was kind of fun.
Oh, wow, cool.
But that's all a side bit.
So we're big Trekkies, so you will see some references in the comic strip.
Now, you also, Karen, you worked for, you guys remember Starlog magazine? Weren't you involved
I
with
was
that?
the West Coast editor of Starlog magazine for a number of years. So you'll see articles by Casey Stevenson and K.S. Wilson and K.E. Wilson and Karen Wilson, and sometimes articles that aren't attributed to anyone, and those were all mine. So
She would write like 3 or 4 articles for one issue because she was the West Coast person that could actually get in touch with the various performers and.
But we'd use
writer.
different names so that, it didn't look like the magazine was written entirely by one person, even though it was.
Now, the comic strip, the He-Man comic strip, is one of the few iterations of the canon where He-Man and Skeletor transition into the New Adventures, and then they actually come back to Eternia at the end, which, if you watch the cartoon, that doesn't happen. So how did the New Adventures portion of the story come about with regard to introducing that? Could you talk a little bit about that? Do you remember?
Well, when they were getting ready to do the New Adventures of He-Man, we had sort of this difficulty of, well, what they're going to do is quite a bit different because we've been doing the old Filmation version of He-Man, and that was the continuity that we were doing both with the character models and the kind of stories that we were telling. They'd maybe be a little more adult than the He-Man cartoons, but they'd still be in that vein. And now they were going to go kind of a different direction with He-Man.
So we just kept telling the stories that we ordinarily told. We were told not to even worry about what it was that they're going to do on the New Adventures.
But we did come up with one of the last stories we did on the strip was a sort of a transition where we had the Filmation version of He-Man get transported into the future, and they wouldn't know if he would ever come back and yada yada. But then we did sort of a side story that would kind of fit into the New Adventures of He-Man universe.
Yeah.
Did they give you models and stuff from the new show?
No, I don't remember that. But I don't have any control of
Yeah.
the way the story was going.
Oh, yeah.
Some of the characters from the New Adventures were drawn according to their model. They were on model like Flog, for example, or Lizor. But some of the, like He-Man and Skeletor themselves, wore their sort of standard outfits. They didn't change into their New Adventures outfits. He-Man had the harness, and Skeletor still looked like the Skeletor we know. So again, I think that's the only version of the New Adventures story where they maintained the looks they had on Eternia. Now, the strip came to an end in early 1991. It was final strips were published early February. Any thoughts on why the strip ended when it did? Anybody
I was
remember?
told that's because the show was not showing anymore on TV.
Because the show wasn't on TV anymore. Okay, yeah. And so the strip ended. And one of the letters that we found when we were going through the paperwork was from Chris to Mattel, where he expresses an interest in having a collected version of the newspaper strips in a book. And Mark DiCamillo from Mattel wrote back and said that would be amazing. That would be a great idea for He-Man's 10th anniversary in 1992. So there was discussion about doing a collection of He-Man newspaper strips for 1992. However, both Chris and Mark DiCamillo weren't sure where the original strips were. They didn't know where the original artwork wound up, because I think Chris asked if it was at Mattel, and it might have been at the syndicate. Nobody could really figure out where the original artwork went. And so the idea was put out there, but it didn't happen until February, when Dark Horse published this book right here, which is a collection of the He-Man newspaper strips. Now, can you talk a little bit about how did it feel to have, yes, thank you, for these folks who worked so hard on this for 4.5 years, had their work recognized here, well deserved. How did it feel to finally see the work you did over all those years collected in a volume?
I have a mixed feeling.
Mixed feelings, yeah. Why so?
Because all this book is selling, even they send it to Europe and all that, but only in America they can put a book like that together and don't pay royalties.
They don't pay royalties, yeah. It's true.
That's amazing.
Because at the time, this was before a lot of the rulings, like with Bob Kane and some of the other creators getting recognized for the creation of their heroes. At that time, there was a lot of, this is work for hire, it's ours, we paid you, goodbye. So that's kind of what happened with this. So from our point of view, it would have been nice to make some money off it, but we appreciated the fact that here are all these stories that the fans in the United States mostly didn't get to see were going to now be available to them. So that part we really liked.
I was really excited when Chris actually found out about PowerCon because he won tickets from a local radio station back in 2000.
When was your first
one?
2011 was our first.
2011. I was listening to the radio on the way home from work, and they said, and then PowerCon, He-Man, and, Thundercats. So I was caller number 7 and came to the convention and met Danielle.
And he came home, and he was so excited. And then I got very excited because I wasn't aware that there was Masters of the Universe fandom out there. I didn't know that anybody was enjoying the animation stories or that anybody would be interested in these things. So we came the next year, met this incredible lady and met Val. And Chris just happened to say, by the way, we have a whole load of photo albums to which he has pasted the cutouts of the daily strip. And wouldn't it be fun if there were a book? Now, why in the world you took that seriously?
You were speaking my language.
We thought, well, maybe you could put this on
He-Man.org.
And, put a strip a week, and that way fans could get to see it. But Val and Danielle had other ideas.
Well, we just it was amazing that they cut out the newspaper strips from the Los Angeles Herald-Examiner, which published the strip for a couple of years. So they would clip them out, and they had about I think a third of the comic strips. So I think 1 year after I think it was PowerCon 2013. Or no, it was San Diego. We were at San Diego, and Val and I asked if we could go to Chris and Karen's house to scan the comic strips. So we kind of bought a scanner and went over there and started scanning strips at their house.
So we had about 4 or 5 big photo albums, the kind that you peel the sticky paper off and put the photo on and put the sticky paper back on. Very 80s technology, but
Yeah, and that's why if you see some of the ones I've posted samples of on the org that have like the lines through them, that's because it's bleeding through on the old photo album page. It had these like ribbed lines on the page. And so we were at Chris and Karen's until the wee hours of the night, and it's about 2 o'clock, 3 o'clock in the morning. Chris and Karen fell asleep on the couch. They were kind enough to let us into their house. I felt really bad. I'm like, we got to finish this. And we went to photocopied a whole bunch of the scripts. We photocopied all your scripts because Chris wrote them all out as movie-length scripts. Fortunately, because of the we only had a portion of them in English, and then we had to go to Brazil and to Greece and India to locate other strips, and we had to kind of take the dialogue from the script page and transpose it on to the dialogue bubbles. This was an immense amount of work, and there was a lot of restoration that took place. Eric Marshall, who's sitting right here, helped us immensely with this. We kind of teamed up and worked on this together. A lot of fans worked on it. Leanne Hanna, who's here, she's a guest at the convention. She worked on it too to restore a lot of the material. And so we scanned the stuff at Chris and Karen's house, and right at this time, the Dark Horse had just announced at San Diego the art book, The Art of He-Man and the Masters of the Universe book. And Val and I were advisors on that book. And then Val put a poll up on the org, which Dark Horse book would you like to see next? And the comic strips scored pretty well on that because our plan was, well, we were going to put them up on the org one a day, as Chris said. But there seemed to be an interest in a comic strip collection, and so Val actually pitched the idea to Dark Horse, and they went for it, and so that's how the ball got rolling. And then the task was to look all over the world to try to find these comic strips. I mean, I was on the phone with Brazil on a regular basis talking to them. I'm Portuguese, so I was speaking to them in Portuguese on the phone, and the newspaper trying to get them to get us the Sundays in color because they have the Sunday colors there, a lot of them, getting magazines from India that reprinted the daily strips and just acquiring materials, getting microfilm and doing high-res scans from microfilm. And one of the things we wound up having to do toward the end was actually fly down to the Library of Congress in Washington, D.C., where Eric met us, and we spent a few days in D.C. At the Library of Congress all day, scanning, doing high-res scans from microfilm that we were having them pull from their archives to obtain whatever we could. And then just at the last minute, as we were about to hit a deadline with Dark Horse, we at that point, I think we're missing about 69 comic strips. I was going through, I was on the phone with Val talking about the book and flipping through stuff that we could use as extra material for the book. And one of the things I ran across was a letter from Chris to the Syndicate where he was talking about a Spanish language newspaper in Los Angeles called La Opinión that was running the strip. And then I looked at the date and it was way late in the run, and I said, oh my goodness, that's about the time period where we were missing strips. So we looked it up we found an archive that had some of the La Opinión newspapers, and lo and behold, there were loads of the missing strips in there. And so we found about half of them at the last minute that we were missing. I think we wound up finding like 34 of them or something like that, about 34 strips that were missing. So Eric saved the day and went back to the Library of Congress at the last minute and scanned everything that we were missing and sent them up to us, and we were able to get those in the book. Now, that said, we are still missing 35 strips. Up until today, we haven't...
We had an accident.
There was a little accident, okay?
As we were getting ready to come to the convention, we said, well, we have a bunch of old stuff in the garage and file cabinets and boxes and stuff, and why don't we bring that to the convention? Because the convention was kind enough to give us a table. So, we dug out a bunch of stuff, and I came across these, which are the proof sheets from the Syndicate. And were these what the newspapers actually ran their copy from, or did they get something else?
They got Gerald's artwork.
No, but I mean the individual newspapers, all 80 newspapers.
I'm not sure. I don't know.
Yeah, I think that's the way
they would run from a copy They would run from a plate. They'd have a plate. They'd have a negative and a plate.
Oh, so the papers would get a negative, something.
The syndicate would probably send them all a negative or a plate.
Yeah. So I guess this.
For some reason, we have these, but we do not know why.
So I looked at them, and it said Editor's Press. Well, I said, well, Editor's Press, to my recollection, was one of the early syndicators.
King was the first.
And it wasn't. So I made this mistake and thought that these were things that were all in the book already. So I said, well, you know, we can have people make donations to charity and get a copy of these. Now, did anybody in here get one of these yesterday? Okay.
See us after the panel, please.
Yes, after the panel, we need to talk to you because it turns out at least a few of these that we had sitting in a file cabinet at home are ones that they were missing and aren't in the book.
Yeah.
We should have had you come and search our garage.
Yeah.
So we have to go through, Danielle is going to go through all the ones that we haven't people did not donate and get copies of, and see if we're really lucky, all the ones that we could have had and we're missing are here. But if they aren't, if you guys know anybody else that got one of these yesterday,
Please have them see us because you can keep them, obviously you bought them, but we would like to scan them at least so we can try to, if there's a reprint, we can get all the missing strips in as many as we can into the book. I accidentally stumbled across, I was at Chris and Karen's table, I went over to say hi and I looked down and immediately I saw a scene from the New Adventures strip because these are so committed to memory at this point. I looked down and I said, oh my goodness, that's a scene with Orko talking to Duke Tiburon and Orko's disguised as Prince Adam. That's missing. That's a missing strip. And then we flipped over and we found another set of missing strips. So we found at least 12 missing strips just from the quick cursory glance that we took there. So you guys might have some missing stuff, so please come up. If anybody bought these, please let us know, and we'd really
and if
appreciate
any
it.
of your friends got them, have them drop by our table. We're at table 404, 405, and we'd really like to check and make sure I didn't
We made a little
accidentally give them
mistake.
away.
Yeah, we can just check it against Karen and
I mean,
Chris's
we
book
raised
here.
$400 for charity yesterday,
Which is
which was
awesome.
great. But you remember the old Felix the Cat cartoons where at the end the professor would be defeated and he would get this machine and he'd pull on it and get kicked? I don't know if you ever saw. He'd pull on it, he'd be kicking himself in the rear. And I needed one of those.
You know, I do have to say something, though, and I have to thank you so much, Danielle, and all the fans that contributed to this, because, you know, you don't know what it's like to have the opportunity to work with a world-class artist and an absolutely fabulous colorist, and then have all of you work for 4.5 years on something, and then have it disappear. And have no opportunity for anyone to be able to enjoy the stories or to read them or to see them ever again. And so, you know, when you guys resurrected our work from the dustbin to let a whole new generation of people read it and look at it, it just meant so much to us.
We've been hearing some amazing stories as people come by.
Thank you.
Thank you.
And we have to thank Val because he pitched the idea over to Dark Horse too. We tag teamed it, so thank you though.
We had one
Val,
guy come by the
if you're listening to
table
this, you're
and
awesome.
say, when I was a little boy, I lived in Dallas. No, he lived in Fort Worth, and the Dallas newspaper carried the He-Man strip.
Are you out there right now, that guy?
No,
Okay.
he's not there. Anyway, so he made a deal with his parents that he would go out and he'd cut lawns and rake leaves and make some extra money, and then they would go to Dallas and buy the newspaper so that he could read the He-Man and Masters of the Universe comic strip. So we thought that was kind of amazing. Another guy came by with his like 8-year-old son and his 12 or 13-year-old daughter and say, you know, every night I used to read them, you know, different books, so we'd have a little bonding time together before bed. Well, I've been reading them He-Man and the Masters of the Universe comic strip at night before they go to bed, just a little bit at a time. And, you know, they go, oh, Dad, one more page. No, it's time for bed. So I thought that was cool.
Yeah, because the artwork, everything about it is just so beautiful. I mean, Gerald, your drawings, I can't believe that you did them in a weekend. On weekends.
That's why I work standing up.
Wow.
It's a test of the emergency broadcast system happening here. What is going on? I don't know. I do want to say there was a really great. I don't know if they're here, but it was a dad and his kids, and he's a member of onhuman.org, and he reads the comic strips to his kids at night before they go to bed. He got the book and he reads it to them, and the kids love the strips and they look forward to having them read to them at night. And so I said, have them write a little something about what they think of the strip, and I'll send it over to Chris and Karen and Gerald and Connie. And so they did. They wrote their little reviews. These kids wrote their reviews of the strip and how much they enjoyed it and how much they appreciate it. And then I sent it to them. And Gerald was awesome. He wrote to me and he said, "What's their address? I want to send them something." And he sent them both original drawings of He-Man that he did specifically for them, thanking them for their notes. It was such a cool thing. They loved that. They were so excited about that. So it was great.
This has got some interesting.
Paul, yes.
He was man at arms in the contest yesterday.
That's right.
Oh.
That's
Awesome.
right. That's right.
Did he win? That was a great costume.
No, he didn't.
Oh, bummer.
It was, yeah, he's a class act. He picked me up a sideshow collectible Gelehrter before I came over. He went out and drove out to Frank and Son so I could bring one back with me to Ireland. So he went and got me one.
Wonderful. Yeah, he's a great guy.
He volunteered on the forum, because I was
Yeah.
wondering if I'd be able to get the hero.
Sideshow does some amazing sculptures if you're
Yeah.
into that.
That's great. We're almost at the end here. If anybody has any questions, please come up to the microphone here.
With regards to the content of the strips, there's a lot about your version of Eternia and its characters that is very distinct from other media, which I really enjoyed when discovering the strips for myself. The stories are slightly more adult in tone than the cartoons were. A bit more of a soap opera feel, and also there's more politics in it, like in the Revolution in Rondale story, where there's virtually no fantasy or sci-fi. It's all about political unrest, and one of the stories presents Eternia in a more modern light rather than the traditional medieval by bringing in an Eternian media, paparazzi, celebrity culture, advertising, and all that. And I found it all really fascinating. So I'd just like to know a little bit about what was your inspiration behind taking this sort of more mature approach to Eternia at the time.
Well, we were thinking about, all right, who reads newspapers? Well, it's not necessarily the 8 and 9-year-olds who are playing with the He-Man toys that are going to read the newspapers, but the long-suffering parents of the 8 and 9-year-olds, or maybe the 8 and 9-year-olds who are now 12 and 13, maybe they'd appreciate seeing He-Man just a little bit more adult, as he said, more stories that would be grounded, at least partially, in something realistic. And, you know, almost anything I would toss out there, I'd send it over to Gerald, and Gerald would look at it, and then he'd come up with something really fantastic to make it look like. I don't know if you know the Disney theory about plussing, where Mr. Disney always used to say, okay, that looks pretty good, but now plus it. Well, we'd send Gerald some stuff, and it'd be interesting, but then he would plus it, and we'd get the really great stuff back that you guys see in the comic strip.
You know, also, Chris has a master's of communication arts and television, which means that he's a fabulous director. And so he was able to take a story and then break it down and write it as an animation script so that Gerald could draw it. My particular background is British history, and I have a degree from UCLA in history, and particularly Tudor England. So I love courts and court politics. And I love the fact that we tried to treat this as a real world. And so we would look at it as these are real people. What is life like for them? What is it actually like to be the son of a king? And what is it actually like to be trying to grow up and have a life and think about your future and to have people that you care about?
And meanwhile, run around and bash Skeletor.
Exactly. Yes. So we had a lot of conversations where we did try to talk about who are the people who are surrounding this family. And one story that I'm sad that we never got to do, but I wish that we had gotten to do, is that we decided in our own minds that this power that He-Man had, that Adam was able to use the power of Grayskull, was something that was generational, that had happened in his family before when Eternia was in a time of great crisis.
We
And
hinted at that in the strip a little.
we hinted at it here and there, and then we pitched that to Mattel. They said, we don't want to do an origin story. But
Which
but-
they did later.
Which they did later anyway. But exploring the why and the how of how this works is the only way you could approach something that's going to last. How many weeks? The average story was like 14 weeks long.
Between 13 and 16, yeah.
Right. So that's the equivalent of each one of those stories is the equivalent of how many?
About half a movie,
Yeah. So it's the equivalent of about 9 22-minute
the whole thing, yeah.
episodes
Something like that.
each
Yeah. Oh, each
for
story,
each
gosh.
story. So you have a much broader palette to paint on. And you have to have something really interesting, but you'll notice that the big fight scenes have a tendency to take place over the weekend. And the reason for that is that's when there's some newspapers that only got to see, some readers only got to see the weekend. So that is the editor, that was my job, was continuity. So I had to make sure that you could read from the end of a daily strip to the next daily strip, and the story would continue to make sense to you. In the meantime, we always had to be working ahead so that we had the next story in development, because these things were coming up really fast. And you could not miss a deadline, because if you missed a deadline, then Gerald wouldn't have time
He's waiting there with his pen.
to draw,
Right.
and Connie
Yeah.
wouldn't have time to color it. So there was no room for error. As a matter of fact, I look back in the book here and there, and I see, oh my gosh, things that I missed, I didn't have a chance to edit out, or the word balloon's going in the wrong place, and I didn't have a chance to tell Gerald that or fix it, or I look at it and it's like looking at a kid with his knees skinned.
All right, we have one more question, and we got to wrap it up.
I literally just looked at my clock and thought I got to get in here.
Yeah.
So I'm a massive Schurr fan. Firstly, thank you for the books. It's absolutely phenomenal. It's a labour of love. I absolutely love having it in my collection. Yes, I'm a huge Schurr fan. So that's a question for Karen and Chris, because One to Count On is one of my favourite episodes, and it's easily the best from season 2 as well. How do you guys work together as a writing kind of partnership? Do you do like a scene each, or do you sort of like throw ideas around together and then do dialogue? How does it work?
Well, we do, like you say, throw around, especially when we're coming up with premises for a story. We would throw around and say, okay, what if He-Man had roller skates? Now that's a dumb story. What if it was the day when He-Man did nothing? Adam wakes up on Sunday morning and has a cup of coffee and feeds Cringer and reads the newspaper, and Skeletor does not attack. And no, that didn't work either.
But often, so we'd sit down and do the story beats. We'd work out where the story was going to go, and then often we would just split the script in half, and then Chris would write half, and then I would write half, and then we'd switch it so that we would get the. Often we'd also go back and read out loud. I'm a terrible actress, but we would read the dialogue out loud and read each character's dialogue sequentially so that we made sure that it sounded right and so that the beats in each one were right. And so we trade it back and forth until it smoothly looked like it was written by one person.
It sounds quite lengthy, but it sounds quite fun as well to kind
is
of
fun.
bounce it off each other.
At one point, we were trying to create something for Ruby Spears, and we had all these little stuffed animals decorating our office at
About
Ruby Spears.
200 of them.
And I'm not sure how it started, but we ended up having a stuffed animal fight while we were trying to discuss what the next point in the story should be.
Yeah.
All right. Well, let's hear it for the comic strip panel here. These folks worked so hard. You can go see them at their tables. They are here at the convention, so they're all sitting together. So please go visit their table and have your book signed if you brought it with you.